In the middle of a barren land, a wandering explorer named Glendale White was deeply desperate for a drop of water. He was traveling for days, and he was extremely exhausted and dehydrated. Just as when he was about to pass out, he heard a faint sound of flowing water from afar. Glendale urgently dragged his feet across the shriveled soil to look for the source, and he saw a ghost town nearby. He was so thirsty that he didn't even question how he was able to hear the subtle sound from that distance. All that he could think of was having a drink in order to survive. As he desperately carried his own weight, a small group of armed horsemen appeared from behind him and blocked his way. Most of them spoke in a different language, but one horseman was able to translate what the others were saying. They adamantly told him to turn away while pointing their guns at him. Glendale rose his hands in fear, but all of them were completely stunned when the translator's head had suddenly exploded. The others frantically rode away, while Glendale fell on his knees with splatters of blood and bits of flesh all over his face. Profoundly terrified and confused, Glendale crawled his way into the abandoned town and hid behind a broken wall. He kept his head down, thinking that the attacker might still be around, but his thirst was triggered when he heard the sound of flowing water once again. It sounded much closer this time around, and so he went to its direction. There was nothing in the town but piles of rubble and fragments of broken walls. One would wonder why there would be flowing water in such a place in the middle of a dreary landscape. He slowly crept towards the sound, and he found an active fountain within this forsaken place. Overwhelmed by delight, Glendale was shaking as he drank to his heart's content. A few moments later, he heard the voice of a little girl. She sounded quite distressed, and she was begging for help. Glendale looked around to find where the voice was coming from, and then he discovered a very strange cell at the center of the ruined plaza. With no more than 4 feet wide and wrapped in layers of chains mounted on the ground, the cell was but a tight box with only the size of a small closet. There was a number of bullet holes all over the box, and there wasn't any window. Aside from the thick chains, it was also bound by a rope with a bunch of mantra cards. There were also a couple of charms hanging on the rope and scattered on the floor. Glendale was reluctant to come any closer to the cell, but he was certain that the voice of the girl was coming from there. He spoke to her and asked if she was inside it just to make sure, and she responded with a quiet and miserable tone. Glendale cautiously took a peek through one of the bullet holes, and in there, he saw the gloomy young girl around the age of 12. For a kid to be locked up with such excessive restraints was quite unthinkable. Glendale asked why she was in there, and she said that she was accused of being a witch. Glendale just stared at her for a while, and then he began to help her. He tried to unmount the chains from the ground, but the anchors were set so firmly that it didn't even budge when he put all his weight behind it. The girl was just watching through the bullet holes, while the explorer was trying everything he could to set her free. Glendale thought aloud and said that he would have more strength if he could eat some food. The girl in the cell heard what he said, and she told him that there was a tree filled with berries just behind the broken wall next to them. Glendale doubted if there was anything edible that could grow in this barren land. He walked around the torn wall and was quite surprised when he realized that she was telling the truth. The tree was bearing more than enough fruit for the hungry explorer, and he ate until he no longer could. When he returned in front of the shackled cell, Glendale noticed that another charm fell off from the rope. There was only one charm remaining, and he looked a bit worried as he stared at it. Glendale tried to dislodge the mounted chains once again. He was able to nudge them bit by bit after regaining some strength, but the anchor was sunk deeper than he thought, and it would take a while to pull it out. Aside from the shackles, another challenge arrived which made things even more difficult. Glendale suddenly heard a gunshot roughly 4 yards away from where he was, and the second shot was fired right next to his feet. It was the same group of horsemen who confronted him earlier, and they were shooting right at him this time around. But for some reason, they were keeping their distance from the town. Glendale immediately hid behind the piles of rubble. They were aggressively yelling at him, but he couldn't understand what they were saying. The horsemen tried to stop Glendale from entering the abandoned town. Since they failed and lost a comrade in the process, they were trying to shoot him down for some reason. Their persistence was remarkable to say the least, and it was all because of the young girl in the cell. They were trying to stop Glendale from removing the chains and freeing her. She was peeking through the holes as the assailants kept on firing. She was worried for the kind explorer who was driven into a corner. All of a sudden, dark clouds rapidly loomed over the entire town. The area was covered in darkness. and the winds wallowed back and forth while scattering the sands and the rubble around them. The horsemen were taken aback and lost their aim. Glendale was protected by this bizarre weather condition, and yet he did not question this unnatural occurrence. He went back out and continued to pull the chains off the ground instead. After pushing himself for more than an hour since he arrived, he was finally able to unmount one of the anchors. However, there were a dozen more that were firmly holding the cell in place. Trying to remove them all was simply impossible for a single man. But then the imprisoned young girl said something to him that did not make any sense at all. Amidst the chaotic noise of the blowing winds, the thunderous clouds, and the random gunfires, she calmly asked Glendale if there was anything he would like to wish for. But instead of getting confused, he slowly walked towards the cell and smiled. Glendale leaned his head against the holes and said, "I've been waiting for you to ask." Glendale knew what was going on all along. He did not come across the abandoned town by accident. They were initially trying to test each other when they met, but due to the difficult circumstance, their true intentions were revealed. He ventured into the barren land for days in order to find the mysterious girl in the cell. He knew what she really was, and he knew the reason was why she was imprisoned. Glendale's wife was severely ill, and the modern medicine at the time had no means of curing her. In order to restore her well-being, he went far and beyond to find some aid regardless of its supernatural nature. After going to different places for quite some time, he heard about the story of a mysterious girl in a small town who could grant any kind of wish. People around her had flourished, but it did not last for long. Out of envy and greed, the townsfolk turned against each other and murdered their fellow neighbors. The few remaining residents realized her true nature after the bloodbath, and they hired a number of mystics in order to stop her. The young girl was neither innocent nor a witch. She was a demon, and all of their attempts to extinguish her had failed. Since the demon could not be killed, they had decided to bind her into a cell for eternity and make sure that nobody would set her free. Despite of her immortality and incredible ability, the power of the demon was not absolute. She could only manifest her power to grant wishes and other things within a limited parameter. The horsemen who tried to stop Glendale were already the third generation of the townsfolk who guarded her cell. She had been locked inside the cramped box for about 3 decades. Because of her ability, many people came before Glendale in order to have their wishes granted. And with every single wish, one of the magical charms that was keeping her bound was rendered useless. When Glendale was already within her power's reach, she granted his strong desire for water and food without even asking. On the other hand, she instantly killed one of the horsemen who unknowingly stepped into her invisible domain when he tried to stop the explorer from reaching her. There was only one charm remaining, and Glendale wouldn't want to lose this precious opportunity. Few moments later, the dark clouds suddenly started moving towards the remaining horsemen who kept on shooting blindly. Flying debris knocked them off their horses, and they cowered in fear when they saw the demon walking alongside Glendale, who freed her. After being imprisoned for decades, this fiend in the guise of an innocent young girl was thirsty for blood and inflicting pain. A wave of heavy rocks came raining down upon them until all their limbs were broken. Pebbles went through their eyes, ears, mouths, and noses, and their innards were scraped again and again. Unlike the horsemen who previously died, they were given a slow and agonizing death. While they screamed and begged for mercy as they coughed out blood and bits of their own flesh, the chains that shackled the demon for a very long time slithered across the ground like a gang of snakes. They coiled tightly around their debilitated bodies and spun rapidly until they were completely torn to shreds. The young girl was grinning as she tortured the remaining horsemen, while Glendale just kept his eyes down until it was all over. The demon kept her word, and she went back with Glendale to heal his wife. Chaos unfolded in different parts of the world soon after. Glendale had to live with the guilt of freeing the demon from her cage, but she managed to save the love of his life in exchange.